right, hello everybody. Good morning in this, how to say, like a scenery, like such a. It's a very cozy weather. We just need like a fireplace with like maybe we add like a new monitor with just having like a fireplace on the side, making it even more cozy. Especially with the banitas, the traditional food to eat in this cozy weather. So yeah, so my name is Rado. You can find me everywhere as Radoslav Stankov everywhere. I have like a Substack called Tips where I share some random tips. And because again, there is a lot of food here and always people make photos of the slides and I change slides very fast and I show a lot of presentations. So all my code from all my slides are already listed here. So you don't need to kind of rush your phones and just take photos. There will be a lot of code because I like doing code when I can. So yeah, today, so if we talk about Rails, there is this slogan, one-person framework. And right now I'm the CTO, the founder, and the only engineer for the next 12 days. We have some new people coming in, but I built this startup, it's going rebuilding, and basically I'm one developer. I built the whole system, I built the mobile app for iOS, Android, and basically a big chunk of that was because Rails really is the one-person framework. Like honestly, again, without Rails, I would have spent a lot more time and coffee and unhealthy food. But yeah, Ruby on Rails is like a great tool. It's like an amazing thing to build. And often again, when we choose technologies, when we choose things, when you need to build stuff, I'm always like asking when people want to build stuff, should I do something new? Should I do something cold? And I'm like, first, again, if you want to build a product, use something you know without. The only exception is if the thing you know cannot solve the particular problem of the things you want to build. If there is like unique technologies that enable stuff. Because one problem with the new exciting tech is there is a lot of fail scenarios which you don't want to do. Like, for example, should I use this other cloud service? I don't know. Does it have something better there? I know OA's AWS bugs and I know how to work around them. That's very, very important. So yeah. So we all know Rails. Rails has a lot of things included in the box, a lot of packages that people actually, this is like, if you open GitHub, this is all the Rails gems with all the stuff that's come here. Surprisingly, some of that stuff I have never used in an actual project, like the thing which receives emails and processes them and do all the magic with them, for example, something very useful. But it had a lot of things. And again, if we open like a new Rails project, we see a lot of like things being included, a lot of batteries included, and that's amazing. That's great. Usually when I come here, I just like comment out some of the stuff I don't need, change some defaults, but in general, Rails and the ecosystem has a lot of pieces. And again, it helps you build a lot of like nice apps and a lot of architectures. But there is also one part of Rails where it's still, again, every project is different. Every project kind of has to build a lot of like its own combining the pieces, but also there is some things that are, in my opinion, missing. That this is something which I noticed like from a lot of other projects. I always have those places which I just copy paste from project to project, some settings, some things, and it's always a lot about like. The funny thing is, I have this photo and the caption is Rado loves active record, and does this look somebody who loves that something? I'm not very photogenetic here. But yeah, in general, again, I really like Ruby on Rails. It's like one of the best things. And because when you love something and you become an expert with it, you know all the things it's missing. So today I'm going to have two things I'm going to share. Like one thing is Rails extensions, like things which I basically copy paste from project to project to project to project to project. And some missing concepts, like things that they are still not in Rails, and it's stuff that I have seen in a lot of projects. People just invent the things around those things. And one funny thing was when I was making the Rails extension part, I'm like, oh, this is missing from Rails. And I'm like, maybe I should look at the documentation, and I see actually Rails had this thing. So I found some features with like shallow routes and some parameters that were actually, I didn't know they existed. So the things I'm going to talk today is like active record, routing, error handling, and internalization. And again, some of those things are basically things like put in every project. Like the first thing for active record, and this is honestly every time I go to a Rails project, even if I don't own it, I add this gem. It's called annotate, which basically puts this comment in front of every active record model. And it's honestly, I have no idea why it's not in Rails, or Rails doesn't have something like that. That it doesn't have it built in.
No. Some of us don't like it.
Somebody doesn't like it. Yeah, that's a personal opinion about all those stuff. The thing about it is, a lot of the times you open a model and you don't know what are the fields. You have to, for example, go to the schema. Often, what are the indexes? What are the foreign keys? Like a lot of the stuff for me, this gem is basically a must. Like, yeah, some people don't like it. Some people.
My team goes there. RS and I go to the schema.
Yeah, but I don't want to go to like the schema because the schema is an SQL file, and when the schema. Oh, by the way, you can ask questions. You can disturb it because it's a lot of like discussion parts. But yeah, I mean it's the thing. But for example, that's why we added it, because we had schema SQL with very complex SQL queries, and you always have to jump between 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 files. And having this in your file, it was actually very useful. And also when you see it like that, it's very obvious. For example, you notice bugs here, like, oh, something here is not null. Like why account ID and user ID in this thing is null. Like why building user ID is null here. What's the reason? And you notice a lot of things when it's like right that. Another thing which Rails has it built in, and it's amazing. And I'm a big fan of counter caches. Rails has a built-in counter cache, which is great, but it's great for like when you have a very clear. So what counter caches does first is when you have a column which counts how many records of some relationship are in the project. So in general Rails terms, you only count the whole relationship, but often, for example, let's say you have a user and, oh, actually here, I have an apartment belongs to building, and some of the apartments are archived apartments, so you want to have a separate counter for that. And this gem, counter culture, what I like about it is allows you to add a lot more complicated counter cache things. So the counter culture gem is basically an extension to the counter caches, and it works amazingly well, especially again, if you have an application that does a lot of calculations. And it also uses counter caches not only for counting columns, but it can also do things like, okay, do a counter cache based on the sum of all transactions, so you don't need to write a lot of the code. So again, Rails has this as a concept, but this is a gem I basically add by default in every project. Another active record concept, which I personally copy paste from every project, is this thing which is called belong to polymorphic. So Rails has polymorphic associations, and again, they are controversial. In some cases you use them, in some cases you don't. It's very useful when you need to attach things to other things. Like let's say you have comments and you want to allow a lot of records on your system to be commentable. Or in my case, I have a nodes, and the node can be attached to many things. One problem with the default Rails implementation is if you just say belongs to polymorphic true, you actually don't have any information about what are all the possible types that I can actually have this polymorphic association being part of. It's a lot of like chasing what is this. And yeah, you can go in the production database and list all the changes, because most probably locally you won't have everything. But having like just basically belongs to polymorphic, what it does is basically validates that those are all the classes that have nodes to. And I have found that in like bigger projects, when you don't exactly know what happens, it's a lot easier to know, oh, this is what these things can have nodes on. There is a concept in Rails which it's called delegated types. How many of you have used delegated types? Yeah, it's kind of similar. The thing with delegated types, it's the reverse association. Like delegated type basically tells you my type is this and I delegate to this, while polymorphic is I own this. So delegated types actually have the same concept like over here. Oops, sorry. Yeah. buy tickets.
Yes.
Yeah, so delegated types, I was very surprised, but also delegated types actually have these things. So it's not something I can imagine being in Rails some days that we say, oh, this polymorphic association allows you only these types. And again, another thing which I do in my projects, which is, I have never seen it somewhere else. So we know how in Rails we have the concerns, when it's like include, concern, and concerns are great if you don't overuse them. But I found them a bit limiting, because imagine you have a concern like has audit log, for example. Imagine this is a concern, and I say this issues activity has an audit, and I want to get all the fields except this one. So having it with a regular concern, you need to define the static method in the concern, then you have to keep that state, you need to call this method, you have to remember to call this method. For example, I have this extension, it's called angry support time as Boolean. Like for example, I have an extension which is like this field indicates that I have a Boolean field which takes its value from like a time at column. And if I have to do this with concerns, I need to do a lot of like meta programming, a lot of like need to define like a static method, then I have to include the concern, and I need to do, and concerns work amazingly well when you don't need to configure them. Like let's say this notification subject is very easy thing I can do. I can say include notification subject, and that works out of the box, no settings and all of that. So again, this is very kind of like concerns. But what I do with my extensions, the way I do them from basically every record, is my extensions just have one method which is called defined, and it receives a model, it receives its settings, and it does all the magic that's kind of needed for its record. So it's done, basically, it decorates the record. It also works as, if you noticed, it also works, this all, oh no, here it's not so visible, but also, what?
We have some extensions which are basically concerns.
Yeah, basically everything, I don't use, in my projects, I don't use concerns, I just use those extensions. Because I will show you the code of the extension, but this basically allows me to say, okay, this is the model, this is the field, and this is basically what I need to do for like Boolean as field. Like, there is a lot of code here. Imagine doing this with like a concern. You have to do a lot of this orchestration yourself, and the user who uses your concern has to call those methods by themselves. They have to know what are the methods, what are the conventions, and they have to do a lot of work, and you need to add a lot of methods to the whole model. And the implementation here is very simple. You just say extension, the extension module, just call def if there is. If there is not, you just basically use it as a concern. So every concern actually can be also an extension. So this is a small trick I kind of use in all my projects, and it helped me a lot with exactly those concerns, which are more like, oh, this is like a small library here. Like for example, have an audit log and just say, okay, I care about all the fields except those ones. So this is something I haven't seen anywhere else done, so most probably I'm totally wrong when doing it, but it worked quite well in like 5-6 places where I introduced those things. Routing. So Rails routing, I really like the Rails routing in general, it's great. Also, Rails has this concept which honestly JavaScript world is still discovering it. You actually can have methods that you code and generate the route, and the methods and the routes are different. So you actually can have a nice routing methods and a nice URLs, and you don't need to remember routes. But with routes, there is one thing which is always missing. I want to use my route helpers outside of the mailer and the action pack. This is something in every project I need some way to get the routes. For example, I want to do a push notification, I want to send an SMS, I want to do, I don't know, just use the routing outside of my main life cycle of the method. And Rails actually has that. You can do Rails routes and do it, and then it blows up because you don't have the default URL options, because it doesn't know the domain, it doesn't know all of that. So in every project, I basically have this class. It's called routes. I include these Rails URL helpers. I set the default options, and everything works. I would focus on these routes custom in a bit. So Sometimes in Rails there is this awesome method. It's called URL4, which it gets a method and like a class, and it gets its route. But the problem is, if your routes are named differently than the models, if you have namespacings, if you have like that. So also one thing with Rails routes is sometimes I actually need custom routes. Like imagine you have like a route which accepts a build. Like in my case, I have an account. Accounts have buildings, and I can filter things by that. So I want to say I give you a building, and you give me like the transactions of this building, and it takes the account of the building for making the route. I want to have like a custom route method. In Rails, having a custom route method, where do you add it? Where does it get into the system? So what I do is I have these routes custom. I default all the routes there. They're included in all the places where that routing is included, and also in this routes helper. So in this way, there is no difference between my custom routes and Rails routes. And for example, instead of URL4, I have something which I call it record path, and I do things like that there, which is not that pretty, but it's very useful in my system because I have a very clear mapping between, oh, this is my models, this is my methods, and it downforce to URL4. I found this very useful because it cleaned up a lot of my routing places, because if you notice, some of my routes are very long. And also having this path record and using the URL4 in general cleans up a lot of you can make a lot of generic helpers instead of just passing those strings. So this is another technique I have found in a lot of places. So another place in Rails, which Rails has a lot of built-in tools and it's very great, it's error infrastructure. And why its error infrastructure is great is because a lot of gems can actually plug in into Rails and get all its data and do a lot of that parts for you. Like you can put something like Sentry, you install it with 2 clicks, or New Relic or whatever, and you get all the error back. However, I have found that in all the projects I make a custom module now named error reporting. Because every error reporting framework, is it Sentry, is it HubSpot, is it Signal, whatever, needs things like, okay, I need to assign a user, like to say in my controller when my user logs in, this is the user who this error is for. Because often when you see an error, you want to know who the user is. You need to get this data. Also, I have used a couple of other helpers here, like capture exception and exception context. Like for example, often I need to be able to capture an exception in my error tracking, and for the user, they don't need to see that exception. Like sometimes when I write code and I get some error state, I use this kind of like a more advanced log. So having this as like a facade around the service, like for example, if I want to use something else in the future, I can just change it. Also, there is some useful things, like for example, with active job, if a job is discarded, like for example, it was tried too many times, you call discarded via some helper or something around it. There isn't, like in Rails, as far as I know, none of the exception trackers by default track all the discarded jobs. Where did they come from? There is a thing there, but you need to like tune it very slow. So I also have this explicitly called in my base active job. If the job is discarded, please tell me about it. Also, again, there is a lot I can talk about exceptions, some self-promotion. I have this talk with videos about, it's called Living Without Exceptions. It's a lot more deep dive on how to have exceptions. So, internalization. Having like internalization tools in Rails, they're actually amazing. Like I'm very happy about them. They're a lot into the whole core of the system. You can basically have a lot. Also, internalization in Ruby in general, and this is very unique to Ruby because I have tried to do internalization in other languages. Ruby has this magic thing called a symbol, which is different than a string. And in other frameworks, they only have strings, like JavaScript and all the things. So with Ruby, what we can do in a lot of places is, if you pass a symbol, the symbol can be treated in a different way. So for example, I have these helpers, which I inject directly into my E18.8 help. One is called tDisplay. And tDisplay is basically a thing which accepts another thing and give you translations of it. So if I get a symbol, and that's the magic of Ruby, that's honestly not other technologies can do something that clean. If I give you a symbol, just translate it. Just go to the translation table, translate me my string, works perfect. If it's a string, okay, just display it. So if this is the username, if I give you a string, just translate it. Apart from that, I have my own tooling around to display. If this is like a record, if it has a display name, just use a translated display. If it's a name, title. Rails has some ways to do like default naming of records, but they don't have one which is explicitly used for translations. But this is something I have found when you do translations in a project, having a helper like this cleans up a lot of noise. And a lot of the times you actually want to say, oh, I know what the text needs to be, and sometimes you want to do the key. And this part is particularly Ruby magic because none of the other technology has like symbols. Like again, some Elixir have but for example, JavaScript, Swift, and other things don't have that. Another two helpers which I found very useful in my is T options, which is basically you give it a collection of records and it just returns them to display them. So basically I can say, oh, here is records, give me all their translations in a list and how they are displayed. And I have T enum, which receives an enum from, like imagine you have a drop down where you pick the status of a product or a state. You just, okay, here's my keys, and I just guess the key name based on that internalization. And also this clean up a lot of the stuff. Another thing, this is more particular for my project. I have those two helper methods which I created. One goes to all the translations and matches all the files. If there is missing strings in them, like if I have a translation in Bulgarian but I don't have it in English, this will blow up. And this goes to OpenAI and just fills up the missing keys, which works surprisingly well. Like I was able, like I didn't know Spanish. I needed to translate like 3,000 keys in Spanish. And then I give it to somebody who understands my domain and understands Spanish, and he only changed like 3 words. And the only reason he changed them is like, yeah, that's correct, but in this domain, this is a bit more specific. And actually this worked quite well. Like just when you have like translations in your project, just go wham them through, okay, my CI ensures I don't have missing keys, and if I have missing keys, okay, just go to something that translates them. All right, yeah, this is some tips around internalization if you care about it. It's like, because I did a lot of work with internalization the last 2 years. Always raise errors in development, only log them in production. I don't like using the nested keys with Rails. Like in your translations, you know, you can have like nested keys. You can just call them by name, which work well when you have like a framework like Rails that can nest errors. But I have found that it's a lot more simpler for me just to have those symbol underscore divided places. It's easier to parse the files, sort it, find the missing keys. And honestly, most of the time when we use that, do we use dot here or we use underscore, it doesn't matter that much, but it makes it a lot faster to work with. Also, again, use defaults. Like a lot of the times which I do in my project is, oh, I have a table column, like I have my tables, and I say the table column name is this. But if the table column name is not translated, maybe it's a form label, because most probably it was entered by a form. So I use a lot of those defaults. So that was like some of the extension part of the Rails. Any questions, comments? Kate from Gennady?
Show you our translation framework.
Oh, that would be fun.
Yeah.
Is it 20 lines?
No.
No. All right, so some of the missing concepts. So this is things that we basically have in every project. So we need to have some UI view things. We need to deal with external services. We need to have some kind of like policy and things that are permissions. We need to do the service object, format object, query object. So the view components, like this is something missing in Rails. It almost got into Rails, but a long time ago, remember the talk from Balkan Ruby about it? Yeah, but view component basically is a tool coming from GitHub, which is like you can basically use classes to define your your helper, like basically define your UI instead of using helpers, because with helpers there is a lot of mess around them, and with partials there is even more mess, even with the new thing with the partials, when the partials actually know. Yeah, the strict locals of the partials is amazing, but they still have those problems. And having view components allows you to just define classes, very simple classes. And also they have this awesome plugin, which is the main or the other reason to have this is the same way in Rails mailers have the mail previews, which are very easy to do. There is this view components previews that you can basically have something like this. And again, having all your view components being able to be separated and developed in works quite well. And do you use view components, do you use flex components or anything else? Doesn't matter in my opinion. The question is, it's really nice to have a class with some local logic, with private methods to do some complicated things and be able to be kind of testable in separation. And I can talk a lot about them, and I have talked a lot about them. Here is a talk from, I think, Ruby Bunitz a couple of years ago about view components. And I also have like a whole post about it. So let's go to another thing, external services. This is something we all hate and we all need to do about it. And the other thing is I have this tweet, every mature Rails project uses every popular and not other popular networking gem. This is something which is like, why we have 200 networking gems? And I know why, everybody dislike something about them, and it's like, all right, we have them, and there is so much about them. And in my opinion, this is something, again, Rails, like before active jobs was in Rails, we had a lot of like job related things. We didn't have a common interface. And I'm surprised Rails haven't done anything with like, oh, there is active networking or something like that where.
So we have the 202nd networking gem here.
Yeah, I mean, think about it, 202nd building part of Rails, which you can actually depend on, right? Also, when we deal with networks, this is a trick actually Gennady taught me long time ago in a galaxy far, far away in Germany. We had this, I have this module when handling errors, so I have this module called handle network errors, and I don't know if you know, when in Ruby you do try-catch blocks, if you pass this module as the handler, it's going to call the triple equals method of the class. So that's how you can actually match if an error matches the error thing. So I have this handle network errors, and I basically have listed all the exceptions of all the libraries that are included in my project. So basically I have like 200 errors here because they're all kind of the same in a lot of the times. You can again split some of the time out, some of the 500s, but you just put this here and you can have like a single way to handle all the errors. This is something I do right now in a lot of my projects. I also, a lot of times I actually use this with active job, where in all my active jobs, if there is like a network error, do like 5 retries, otherwise discard the job, lock it, and so on and so forth. One great thing with Rails, which I'm so happy they added this a long time ago, is the secure credentials in the YAML file. So this is amazingly having this, because before that we need to juggle environment variables, or we needed to do a lot of like the key security, like KMS and other Amazon sounding weird things. So this is always great. I always like, for example, when I do services, I always have that keys in my system. I have the service name, the token, the secret, and I always have this comment. By the way, please, every time you add something to this file, if you learn anything from this talk, add this comment. This key is taken from this URL. Especially if it's a Google service. With Google services, you have no idea where this key comes from. And every time I have a pull request and I see this file is changed, I go in and I beat people with a head if they haven't had this. Where do you get this key from? Because I cannot tell you how many times some developer on the team registered with their company account to some service, and they didn't use the company account of the service, so when they leave and their service expires, the keys blows up and we're like, where did this key come from? Especially now when people just randomly register for OpenAI key, that's a problem to have that there. Another thing I do to battle the external services stuff is everything which I do in my projects regarding external services is grouped into its own namespace. It's always called external, its namespace. So I know if I call it, that means network call. External is always a network code. I have this template. It's always like a documentation, like, okay, this is the service, this is the URL of the service, this is where do we manage tokens from, this is the API documentation. If we are using a gem, this is the gem that's being wrapped by this service. The idea here is, if you have 200 of those services, it's very hard to know details around stuff. Also, I have it like my favorite extend self, so this is just like a facade in front of all the external services. And this facade basically always have documentation around. Okay, we are calling this method from this documentation with this area. And here is an example with Unsplash. Like, Unsplash is a service for images. So in a project, we needed to have with Unsplash two things: search and tracking download, because they want you to track the downloads. And this is how this looked like. I was like, okay, my service is Unsplash, this is the documentation, this is the gem we are using, this is the portal where we get our OAuth tokens. And this is documentation here again. This is the wrap of the URLs. Here we also handle the errors, like we hide all those networking errors regarding this. And for the developers, they just use this. And every time you want to say, oh, I just need this one search place in one product in my application, that's a problem, because you don't know what are the external calls your application does. Another funny thing was on a project I helped with, they didn't have that, and they needed to block all external network calls from the firewall of their like pods. And they were like, do we call this service? And they had no idea which were the upcoming networking calls. And if you have something like this, it's very easy. You just go to one folder and just go next. I actually have a blog post about it with like a long dealing more with external services. So networking, again, is something where, again, Rails has some great fundamentals, but we need, a lot of the times people just, okay, I just write this gem, I'll just include it, and we use it directly. And the main thing, in my opinion, is never just use the gems directly, just wrap them, so if they change versions, if they change APIs, becomes very hard. Like something like Stripe, for example. Yeah, it's very big action point, but it's really good if you just had all the networking, which you don't own, in its own like bucket. Even if it's a lot more code, if you think, why should I make two codes here? It makes sense when they break API or you need to update. Another thing, how are we time? 20 minutes, okay.
I won't give for some time. You can go.
I'm done in 5. I'm joking, I'm not. So, another thing, we have something, it's policy objects. Like, Rails right now have these awesome tools around how you can make your own logging system, but one area which kind of is still missing is how do we authorize? How do we handle the authorization in like a Rails project? Every project kind of like thinks about like the authorization themselves. Right now, I think the most popular gem is Pundit. Pundit? What? That's what I think. I personally use the project because Pundit didn't exist like 10, 15 years ago. I had a gem called Kitty Policy, which is my own version of like policy files. And again, this is something I personally use project to project because Kitty Policy is just a gem I wrote to build authorization system particular for each project. And Kitty Policy is very simple. If you don't use Kitty Policy, you just write something like this. This is how Kitty Policy started. We have a file which was called application policy, and this is like all the permissions our system needed to apply. It used my favorite extend self method with like static methods, which is like can access account, user account. If the user is null, return false. If the user is admin, or if it's account member, the user. Like having this file with like 200 methods. This basically is the authorization system, which I found very useful because all the authorization was in central place. It was big, it was obvious, it was easy to test, it didn't have any state, it didn't do any. So this does zero allocations, because one thing, if you have like something which I don't like about Pundit is you need to instantiate a lot of classes and you do a lot of guesswork with class names with like a long structures. And if you have like a GraphQL API where every field you have the authorization check if the user can see this field or they cannot, it becomes really a lot of like, lookups and things like that. With here, again, you have zero, you can just say, okay, just guess me a new method name and just call it. And what Qt policy does is basically this method here becomes something like this. It removes some of the noise, like it doesn't need to check if the user is a guest. It can say, okay, this is the policy, this is the method. It basically generates the same name method here. It just has like a small DSL to do that, basically skipping me this part and make it more consistent the naming. So I can do things like, can a user action, whatever, this is a Boolean operation, so this returns true or false, or this blows up, where the user cannot access certain things. So this rises like, and this is basically what Qt policy is on 2 level. It's like 20 lines. The thing about it is, in my current startup, we have a very expensive permission system with a lot of like rules, a lot of business rules, a lot of roles. So we have this custom role DSL for our particular application, which was built on top of Qt policy, because again, with the policy system of every application is different. Like what you need is not like, this is the exact solution, this is the building blocks to build your own solution for the authorization. So what I have here in my startup particularly, I have something which I call it role stacking. That means that, for example, the director has whatever the director can do, whatever the supervisor can do, the operator, the cashier. So I have like this branch tree. So I can just write these DSL methods, which is like building cashier can view each role. That means the supervisor, the director, the operator can also do that. So I can list all the actions and everything here kind of works. And I have basically this one-liner to basically define like a map of all my permission of all my systems. So every time I need to adjust those, it's very simple. And right now, this was like 2 weeks ago when I was making these slides, this file had like 273 lines. From those lines, like 20 are like just comments, DSLs and things like that, but there were a lot of rules. And imagine those 200, if those were like classes with like 20 lines of class names with a lot of, and I just want to have like this simple map. And the other thing which was very key for me is having those 2 methods, especially this one. So application policy authorized, I can call it from everywhere. I don't need to think about the class name. I don't need to think anything. So in my application, I have those things which I enforce. One is called require account feature. So this checks the current account. It blows up if the account cannot do calendar. But the key here is find record. Find record is tries to find this record and it checks if the current user can actually see this record. Like for example, so here I can give it like an option authorized method. So I have this system here where if the user, for example, cannot find a record, this blows up with Qt policy access denied. I can actually put this in my error reporting so I know somebody tried to access something they shouldn't. Most probably I have a link somewhere, which is not with the can and the user clicked it by mistake, and I have like a system unauthorized. But this is how find record actually looks like. It's a very simple method, which every record to my system goes to this thing, because most of the time when you are trying to find something, you start from somewhere. So find record does like, okay, find me, get me the scope, or like figure out it, then goes to the authorized. Like, okay, now can this user do what with this record? And then I also have this check here, is if I had this required feature calendar, I'm checking if the account of the record actually has this feature, because I can throw up other things. And having this method actually was very awesome, Like I started my project, this part here didn't exist. Like this part didn't exist with the find record. And because it didn't exist, when I needed to add, I need to restrict certain actions because we now have 2 plans, I just changed these 2 lines and I didn't change anything in my other controllers. I also here, this method actually has 6 more things. Like for example, if your account is deactivated, you shouldn't be able to do almost anything. So I also had this logic here. So this find record is very useful when you build like a system to have like a single place where all the loading of records come from, because it's very useful for you to kind of have this central place to check the authorization, not to think about, I'll think it on a controller level, just think it on like a loading level. Another thing which I have found out useful in my project in particular, I have noticed a lot of people also do it, is a lot of records in our system are trees. Like they have an account, the account owns something else like a project, the project owns a task, and from like every record, you can actually go to the root of the tree in some way, and you care about the current user related to their account level. Like, so I also have this thing which is like accounts, get me the account of the records. And in this way, I can say, is this feature available for this record? Where I go to the tree, get the account, and just say, okay, this feature available. So yeah, that's the Kitty policy gem. But the idea here is not the gem itself, because again, it's 20 lines. But the idea here is if you build your authentication system, you do it in such a way that it's kind of encapsulated and it happens in your whole system. It's not something that the developer should think of. Okay. And yep, I need to just come back. So yeah. So far so good. So much content. You have no idea how much I cut from this presentation. So, service objects, like this is like something where there is a lot of debates, a lot of discussions, and for me, honestly, that's my service object. No external libraries, Rails doesn't need to solve that, it's just, I do this for service object. I just have a module, I do extend self, I have like a usually method call, if I need multiple methods, I just have multiple methods. Everything else is private, I don't care. Like, for me, that's like the most simple way to start and doing stuff. And then again, if you need, you add like, I have thought, maybe I have like an application service object or something like this. But there is so much stuff you don't need here. So yeah, personally what I do is just I have like service objects, which are just basically functions, like a globally named functions. And I use the method call because I can actually use the Ruby built-in use of calls in different places. Like for example, is it a lambda, is it like proc, is it like a module with a class that have a call? It's the same. So I can do a lot of my service object compose them. The thing I do mostly is form objects, and I have my own gem mini form, which is basically the same thing as active model. It just has some nice goodies, which I have seen a lot of projects when they basically have an application form, which is their own version of action models, and they compile like different parts what they need. And I think that's something good that people should do. One area here, which I personally also like is, and I have noticed a lot of people still have it in the controllers, they need to fill all the fields, but often you need one form per one controller. And often I have this method that I call submit and submit underscore, where it's like I actually guessed what are the permit required form params. So I just get the params to the form. I don't need to think about, how is the form named? What's in this form? If I add a new field, I have to go not only to the form UI, I need to go to the controller, I need to list it there, I need to change like 5 things on the pipeline. Usually I just say, okay, just get me all the attributes names from this particular form, and I care about that the form is my shield from like all the fields. And it works well because the form is like a nice shield. It's not, you're not calling the model directly. Plus, I changed this default option in Rails. Every form has an S field, and by default, the form field is the name of the model. It's like, let's say projects, and it's named project. Let's say it's account template, it's account template. And I have found this very unuseful for me because every time I change the model name or I change the form, I need to go to 5 places and change the params, whatever thingy. So all my forms, basically the input form is form, because why not? Never seen something, it's very simple, it works quite well. And yeah, and the other thing with the forms is I can just have my controllers mostly look like that. I can say, okay, this is a calendar event controller, so attendees controller, so I can just say, okay, create me a form of the attendee with an event. I can do, okay, get me the calendar attendee form with like find event. I can say a submit. The submit would get the params, directly gets the params. You don't have a separate method which lists all the params with all the fields. And again, I have the find event here, which uses the find tracker to make sure the current user can actually manage this event. And I use this very old, extracted from REST, yeah?
Does that work with like more nested params?
Oh yeah, like my version, the one I use in my application, works with the, like deep nestings, and it validates the keys. I didn't show the whole code because it's like 30 lines and it's too early in the morning, and this is non-alcoholic yet, so it's. But yeah, it also I can show the version with like the big deep nestings, because I also have like delegations and things like that connect with the thing. But another thing I think I'm the only one still using the gem responders from like 200 years ago, which was part of Rails, then they remove it. But I still really like this respond with, because what respond with does is it checks the record, and if the record has validation errors, it renders the error page. If it doesn't have validation errors, it just goes to this location. And it's like, how many times do I need to write if valid, remember that? So I just have this. It's a bit of magical, but I still like it. If this gem stopped working, I'll just inline it and use it myself. Huh?
There you go. You can inline it in the application controller.
If I need it, I will do it. Like this is like a really, and also the other nice thing about this gem is how it automatically also sets the flash message, and because it automatically, in my application particularly, all the flash messages are connected to the internalization system. So I actually have flash message. This record was created and it's already translated and it all works, and I don't need to think about all the namings. And when new developer starts working on my project, they don't need to think about what's my naming schedule for Flash events. What would happen is they're going to implement this, it's going to blow up and tell them, you don't have this key registered, and they just would register the key. And then they would automatically do translations, and it will be translated into 5 other languages, and who cares? Yeah, but that's the thing. What I do is, I have found out, we talk about in the Rails community a lot about the service objects and not so much about the form objects. And actually the form objects are, I think, the one separation between like a service object and a form object is, I think, very important, because the form object deals with like the user input and it packages it for the user. It has a lot which active model is really great at. And the service object is something that's more, okay, doesn't have 200 error states, it's just a function and operation. And having this separation is very useful. Like for example, service objects oftentimes are called from active jobs or like some external thing, while the form objects always work from like a user input. Also, I have like a GraphQL API, and the GraphQL mutations are perfect for form objects. I often in my previous company, we had form objects for a UI form in the admin, and we used the same form object for a GraphQL mutation, and they map very well to that. So yeah, I'm getting to the end, and it's almost 2 minutes left. So, query objects. So often, this is another thing. Often we need to build stuff like that. This is for my application. When we have this very complex search form, we have some statistics for that search, and we have search results. And this is a gem I created like 15 years ago, literally 15 years ago. It's called search object. I'm very creative with names, if you noticed. So search object allows you to create like, this form is basically search, finance, transaction, search, filters, params, results. And usually if you need to implement an object like this, I used to do like this 15 years ago. I create this class, I get the filters, and I basically do this. If the filter is this, just reiterate through the scope and get me like pagination, like add me the pages here. And again, cache me the results, because again, the results, if I call it 20 times, I just want one query. So I started with this like 15 years ago. I built this into a gem where it's like, I include the search object with Kaminari for pagination. I set the initial scope, I get the options, and I have more. Again, this is how we get the options. It's basically the same thing. And also, this is actually, Gennady added this 12 years ago. You added this feature, the width. Yeah, you added the width. And the nice thing about this, having this object, even if you don't use my gem, if you just use the, like, you write this by yourself, having an object, having a place to put stuff on, you can add methods for, oh, give me the balance, give me the income, give me the expense, give me the count. Like, this part, you can just add it to your classes. You don't need like third-party library. You can just have like a class that combines those searches, and it can give you the statistics based on all those filters. Also, if you have more advanced forms, those forms have drop-downs. And for example, having this class, I can actually put in this class, this is the cashier options, this is the source options, this is the type options. And having all of this in a central place in the search object is very useful to build it everywhere. And yeah, right now in my startup, I use it a lot for UI forms, the one I showed you. And the nice thing is, if you have this, you can actually build table in UI across of that, because it's like a static, right? It's like a standardized. Also, I have used the same strategy with search object for APIs. Like if you have like an API or GraphQL API, you can have those compositionable search objects. So this is another thing which is very useful to think about, like, okay, in a Rails project, this is all the things we have. So yeah, this is again, in most Rails projects, everybody has variations of those things. And the big question is, where do those things live? I think this is another thing. So if you think about it, what I told you today, maybe in my app I have app policies, services, forms, and queries, and that's great. And that's great. But I have other projects. Like I have, let's say I have the external stuff, which I would name it app network, because this goes to the network. Oh, I have the validators as well. Maybe we have decorators. Maybe we have presenters, because you know the big difference between presenters and decorators, they shouldn't be mixed because people get confused. We also have notifiers for like notifications. Oh, we have app values, because maybe we have some value objects and we have heard it's a very useful thing. Also, maybe we need some support code, like I have a library, internal library for my project called Angry Support for like the support library. Also, maybe others is also useful, because sometimes we don't know where to put stuff in all of that. And again, it's always a lot of discussions where to put stuff. And again, for me, it was always like, oh my God. And it's like, oh, we should put everything in one folder. Like, oh man, this is such a mess. Then it's like, okay, put every object in their own folder. It becomes more messy. And again, I'm back to everything in one folder. What I do in all my projects right now is, basically I have app lib. So I move the lib from like down there to app lib, because it's, I think, very important. And I use aggressive namespacing for the domain. So for example, I have search object. If you noticed, I had the finance transaction search object. I didn't have search transactions. I start with the domain, because it was very useful, because when I go to my finance namespace, I see, oh, transaction search, transaction form, transaction edit, whatever. Now I might maybe have finance transaction, and I can group all those things. So I have this, and this is right now how everything looks in my lib folder. You can notice my domain. I have the accounts, I have the Angry Batch, I have Angry Support, apartments, external, export, funds, graph, heating, which will be very useful right now. If I look at that, messaging, payment, registration, schedule, search, and all the other stuff, but it's here by domain. So when a developer starts thinking about stuff, they can do the fuzzy search and say, oh, I search for the form object, but it's finance, so I do finance form, and it lists me all the forms. And yeah, it's like a lot of like the YOLO kind of like, everything is there, everything is great, and everybody's so happy. So yeah, this is a lot of the stuff which, again, I was like, okay, every time I start a new Rails project, I'm going to the slides and just copy pasting stuff because I don't do Rails project that often because it's so much work to copy paste all those settings. But those I found like a lot of like the stuff that's kind of like the missing parts. And yeah, that's pretty much all, and I'm done on time.